Okay, I've started a recording for our second session. Apologize that I still have the PTP things, headers on the slides. Okay, are you self-employed? Are you an employee? And a minister is unique in this situation. There are about 5 or 6 different things that someone could get a W-2 for, but not have Social Security or Medicare withheld. The minister is one of those, and I'll show you the W-2 for a minister in just a few minutes now. A self-employed minister is issued a 1099. Actually, this is not an MISC any longer. It's an NEC, non-employee compensation. Starting last year, they issued NECs instead of MISCs. An employee is issued a W-2. For the IRS consideration, their stance is that all ministers are employees. I'm not sharing the screen, am I?
No, you're not.
Okay. All right, now I am, so that should help.
Yep.
So the IRS stance is that all ministers are employees for income tax reporting purposes, but are self-employed for Social Security purposes. So as such, ministers should be issued a W-2 instead of a 1099. Now, I know plenty of churches that issue their ministers a 1099. I don't understand it. They usually have a EIN, an employee identification number, the church does. So I don't know why they do it. I choose not to argue with them about it. It's get back up here. Now, this is like a W-2, and it hasn't changed since 2016 materially. This is a W-2 that would be issued to a minister. I assume that where you work right now, you get a W-2. And you see that this has a lot less information on it. For a minister, we only report box 1, which wages, tax, tips, and other compensation. Box 14, we put any housing allowance in. And box 16 is estate wages, tips, or other compensation. Now, if we have agreed with the minister, we will withhold taxes, then we can put something in box 2 and something in box 17. The church's name and address goes in box C. The employee's name and address goes in box D. But Social Security wages are blank. Social Security taxes are blank. Medicare wages are blank. Medicare taxes are blank. Unless you work in a restaurant, Social Security tips would generally be blank, and allocated tips also would be blank. And then all the rest of the stuff, box 9, 10, 11, you know, all those 12, 13, you know, maybe occasionally something may be in box 13, usually not. So box 1, box 14, box 16 is where a minister would get their information, and the church would only fill out those 3 boxes. The This minister made $70,000. And I know that by adding box 1 and box 14. Box 14 is his housing allowance at $22,500. Box 14 is $70,000 less the $22,500, $47,500. What difference does it make? Well, if you are a W-2 employee and they withhold Social Security, Medicare taxes, you only pay 7.65%, but a self-employed individual would pay 15.3%, both sides of the Social Security, Medicare. As wages, if you get a W-2, these wages go on line 7 of the 1040. Instead of line 1, a Schedule C. And your expenses. Now, for starting in 2018, going to 2025, they made miscellaneous itemized deductions on Schedule A non-deductible. So this would not apply for this year, for prior years from 2018, for future years up through 2025. In 2026, the deductibility of miscellaneous items on Schedule A are supposed to come back. Those would be, once again, subject to 2% of AGI, the floor that you have to exceed before you get any deduction. And if you get, though, on your Schedule C as a self-employed person, if you take your deductions on Schedule C, you get 100% of them there. Your fringe benefits. If you're an employee, they can be tax-free. If you're a Schedule C person, you're not due fringe benefits, so anything you got would be taxable income to you. Then you have what retirement plans would be available to you. If you are Schedule C, you have a limitation on which retirement plans you have. But as a minister and employee, you have a lot more availability of retirement plans for yourself. And then liability for misconduct. If you're an employee and church is hiring you, they generally bear some element of liability if you should conduct misconduct for the church. Whereas if you're a self-employed individual, you bear the total brunt of the liability for misconduct. So I told you that generally the IRS deems all ministers to be employees for purposes of W-2 presentation, but for self-employment income, Social Security income, they're self-employed, so they're a mixed factor. So the IRS has a 3-factor test and a 20-factor test that they use to look at whether you're a minister or self-employed or an employee. The tax court has a 7-factor test. The Supreme Court has a 12-factor test. Wish they could all come together on one and agree with it, but there are currently 4 different tests out there, plus income tax regulations that include a corporate officer test. So let's look at the 3-factor test. They all look at, various tests look at the degree of control and the degree of independence of the parties. So the 3-factor test that the IRS has looks at, you have behavioral control, you have financial control, and what is the type of relationship. That is a little more wishy-washy, a little harder to get our hands around. So let's look at the details of the 20-factor IRS test. The 20-factor test, and we're going to look at what all those 20 factors are. Is the worker required to comply with instructions about when, where, and how to work? So that as a church, does the leadership of the church tell the minister when, where, and how he's to work? They may tell him when they want him to preach. They may tell him what they want him to do, what office hours they want him to keep, etc., etc. Number 2, is the worker trained by an experienced employee or by other means? So if you have on-the-job training and you're a associate minister and the experienced minister comes in and does additional training for you, or you go to GSOP or Memphis School of Preaching or some other to get training to be a minister, that's what this is looking at. How is the worker trained? Is the worker trained also by his own functions, or is it the functions of the employer that train him? Number 3, are the worker's services integrated into the employer's business operations? Number 4, must services be rendered personally by the worker? And for ministers, it would be hard to argue that you could let anyone do the work for you rather than you do it yourself. Number 5, does the church hire, supervise, and pay assistants to assist the worker? So if they have a church secretary that takes notes for the minister and does other things for the minister and makes calls and makes appointments and set, does the church hire them, or does a minister hire them and supervise them and pay them directly? Number 6, is there a continuing working relationship between the church and the worker? Number 7, does the employer establish set hours of work? We talked about earlier, they may decide that you need to maintain office hours of such and such to such and such, 3 days a week or 5 days a week or whatever. So the church would argue that you would be an employee if the employer set those hours when you should be working. And must the worker devote full time to the church's business? Now, I understand that some ministers are part-time. If the church has agreed that they can be part-time, that may be fine. Must the worker perform his duties on the church premises? If you're a minister and you go to a coffee house or a deli or somewhere and you sit there for 2 or 3 hours and study your Bible and prepare your sermons, do they provide you an office in the church for you to do that sort of stuff? Or is it just up to you as to where you can do that? Must the worker perform services in an order or sequence set by the church? I don't know that that's specifically talking worship services versus other services that they may do, but most of us do have fairly standard services that we perform in a specific order, and sometimes we will vary that. You know, we joke about 2 songs of prayer and a song and then sermon, and you know, but it's fairly common that we see that. Is the worker required to submit regular oral or written reports? We have 4 ministers that currently work for us, and we meet with them once a month. First Sunday we meet with one, the pulpit minister. Second Sunday we meet with the person who's in charge of the education program. Third Sunday we meet with one who's doing outreach for college work. And the fourth Sunday we meet with the director of GSOP. So we meet regularly, and they provide oral generally. We don't require that they do written reports, but they do oral reports for us. Is the worker paid by the hour, by the week, or by the month? If they're paid by the hour, then it argues maybe that they're more of the self-employed. Whereas if they're paid by the month, you know, it can be argued either way. We generally pay our ministers twice a month, semi-monthly payroll, and set amount. So we agreed with them when we hired them what they would get paid, and that their pay will be every other or twice a month. Does the church pay the workers' business expenses? We'll get on deeper into that in one of the later classes about deductibility of business expenses and if the church does pay them. Does the church furnish tools and materials for the workers' use? Do they provide a desk for him to sit at? Do they provide chair for him to sit in? Do they provide guest chairs for his office? Do they provide bookshelves for his office? Do they provide filing cabinets, et cetera, or does the minister provide all those things for himself? And if they provide, the minister provides them, then it's arguing that he's self-employed. If the church provides him, it argues that he's an employee. Does a church furnish all necessary facilities, equipment, and premises? May the worker realize a profit or suffer a loss as a result of his services? And the last 4, does a worker perform services for a number of organizations? So if we had circuit riding preachers, once again, they preach this Sunday at this place, this next Sunday at somewhere else, the third Sunday somewhere else, the fourth Sunday somewhere different. You know, those would make arguments about for them being self-employed. Does a worker make his services available to the general public? You may look at weddings and funerals and say, yes, I make my services available, but really, is that a large part of your services or just a minor part of your services? Can the church dismiss the worker at any time? Or does the worker have some say about whether they're going to be there? Can the worker end the relationship with the church at any time without incurring liability? Our agreement with our ministers is that they will give us 90 days notice, we will give them 90 days notice. Primarily to protect both sides. 90 days gives us some time to at least start, if not finish the search for someone to replace them. 90 days from as far as the minister is concerned gives them time to plan for and you know, have availability of continuing work if we're firing them. So, you know, those last two, the church or the worker, those both play into it. Now, this is the IRS's 20-factor test. And they would go through each factor, rate the factor, whether it was indicating employment and employee status or self-employed status, or it was neutral. So if they're neutral, they don't count. If they're employee status, you add up all the ones that are employee status and all the ones that indicate self-employed status, and then you gauge how much of the 20 factors, how much of it indicates employee versus how much of it indicates self-employed. So let's look at some court cases. In Alford, a self-employed individual. We'll look at all the details of the self-employed here later. Alford, that was in 1997. Weber was in 1994, which the courts deemed him to be, the tax court deemed him to be an employee. Rayday in 1997, the tax court in a memo ruling deemed him to be an employee. In Shelley in 1994, they deemed him to be self-employed. In Green in 1994, they deemed him to be self-employed. And a private letter ruling, the vast majority say an employee. So let's look at those self-employed and see what made them say self-employed. Alford, the first case there, he was an ordained Assemblies of God minister. His status as self-employed was determined by the lack of control by the local church over his activities. He supplied his own furniture. He supplied all his equipment used in his daily functions, and he set his own schedule. So they said that the church really had no say over it, and that he was self-employed, and therefore he qualified as self-employed. Shelley, a case in 1994 in the tax court. Pentecostal holiness minister. He was hired for his specialized skills and style. He was chair of the church board with the authority to appoint the members of the board. He was not supervised or evaluated. And he paid for his own continuing education, and he used his own library. So all the evidence, especially the evidence that he was chair of the church board with the authority to appoint the members of the board, said that he was self-employed. The church was not his employer. Green in 1996, an Assemblies of God foreign missionary. He raised his own support and even hired and paid others to assist in raising support. He decided where he would establish his ministry. He decided what services would be available through his ministry, and he decided when he would leave his ministry. And the tax court deemed him to be self-employed. Now, we see some self-employed situations fairly common. a guest speaker who handles gospel meetings, lecture series, PTP, et cetera, et cetera. Those are self-employed situations. We generally pay the teachers at GSOP 1099 NEC. They are self-employed situations. Services provided directly to the members, weddings, funerals, etc. Those would be self-employed because the church doesn't say what can be charged for that, doesn't say when they can be charged. Now, we as an eldership do direct our ministers to not conduct weddings for people who are not members of the church, but we don't tell them what weddings to do. We just give them general guidance on which weddings they should do. Itinerant evangelists. Here one day, they're the next Sunday, they're the next Sunday, somewhere else the third Sunday. Jenkins Institute. When they're on the road 40 plus weeks out of the year, somebody that's conducting missionary work and they're out raising funds 30 or 40 or 50 weeks out of the year. They could be itinerant evangelists. They would be self-employed situations. But remember that the IRS will always claim that a minister is an employee for income tax purposes. Most ministers will have a mixture of employee and self-employed income. Their self-employed income deriving from weddings, meetings, lectureships, etc. There is a Revenue Act of 1978. It's applicable here. It's also applicable in the construction industry, which I do a lot of my CPA work for construction industries. So the Revenue Act of 1978, Section 530, said that if it's common in your industry for people to be self-employed, and you're doing that work such that that is the case, then it may be a safe harbor for you that if you meet the rules and regulations of Section 530, you could claim a safe harbor there if the IRS should audit you. The IRS also started a voluntary classification settlement program. If your church has been treating you as self-employed and they wanted to change and make you an employee, then this voluntary settlement classification program that they began in 2012 is somewhere you should look for. Okay, questions?
One question.
Okay.
You had mentioned about the tax forms. If the church offers you a 1099, but you prefer a W-2, and they have an issue with that, what could you do, or what can you do?
Ask the treasurer to call me.
Okay. Okay.
And I'll tell them that what the IRS rules are.
Okay.
Most of them they don't want to do a W-2 because they think they haven't withheld Social Security, they haven't withheld Medicare, they haven't withheld income taxes, and they don't think they can put that on a W-2.
Oh,
You remember the W-2 we saw has box 1, box 14, box 17. Only
right.
boxes with numbers in them.
Okay.
Most CPAs don't understand that
Hmm.
because they've never dealt with it.
Mm-hmm.
They would look at that and say, that's not right. Why is nothing in box 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7? You know,
Right.
but the IRS says that's right. In fact, I just sent forms this week to the IRS for our church with our 4 ministers, and then our secretary. Our secretary has box 1, box 2, box 3, box 4, box 5, box 6, you know, all filled out. Our ministers have box 1, box 14, box 17. Now, 2 of our ministers, we have do some voluntary withholding because they have asked us to, and we'll talk later about that. That's perfectly legitimate. So on those 2, box 2 and box 17 are also have a number in them, but that's all that's there.
Mm-hmm.
And somebody that's never dealt with the minister taxation doesn't understand that.
Right.
They think something has to be in every box, or every box, generally 1 through 6, and they don't understand.
Mm-hmm.
So a church sending something out like this is no different. I mean, the benefit of this as opposed to a 1099, do they give you a housing allowance on currently? Does the church of which you're speaking provide a housing allowance?
Currently, no.
Okay. If they provided a housing allowance, and we'll talk about that again later on, and I recommend that you do that. So if they provide a housing allowance, box 14 is where that goes.
Okay.
On a 1099 NEC, as we said earlier, this guy made $70,000.
Mm-hmm.
Do they, if they provided a 22.5 housing allowance, what number are they going to put on the 1099 NEC? Are they going to put the 70,000, or are they going to put 47.5? And if they put the 47.5, where are they going to put the housing allowance?
Mm.
There's nowhere on the 1099 NEC to do that.
And then the 1099 will be self-employed too, correct?
Yeah. Well, you're
Mhm.
going to get treated as self-employed by for Social Security tax purposes. You're treated as self-employed.
Okay.
So it doesn't matter what they gave you as far as now. We'll go through when we go through examples of tax liabilities. We'll see that a self-employed person has a different tax liability than an employee. Somebody that got a W-2 versus somebody that got a 1099.
Right.
But it's minor, not major.
Okay.
Minor difference. But so yeah, I'd be glad to talk to him because the IRS says you should do a W-2. the church, it makes more sense for the church to do a W-2 if they're paying something as housing allowance. Because they've got somewhere where they can show the housing allowance in box 14.
Hmm.
They can't show that on the 1099.
I understand.
Okay.
Okay.
Any other questions?
No, that would be it.
Okay. Let me save this in the recording and save this. And I will send out recordings tonight to you and another student who's taking another class at the time this one is.
Okay.
Let me stop share.